As I walked my youngest daughter down the aisle after raising her alone, my son-in-law shouted into the microphone, "Here comes the poor old man who was only invited out of pity." The groom's wealthy family burst out laughing until the best man yelled, "I saw that billionaire on TV yesterday. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from." The church was magnificent. Every pew draped in ivory silk, every flower arrangement worth more than I used to make in a month. I should have felt proud walking my youngest daughter down that aisle, but instead, my chest felt tight with a familiar ache I'd been carrying for years. Emma's arm was looped through mine, but I could feel the tension in her grip. She'd been distant all morning, barely meeting my eyes during our final moments together before the ceremony. The white dress she wore cost more than my monthly rent, paid for by her future in-laws, of course. The Ashfords had made sure everyone knew they were footing the bill for this extravaganza. As we began our walk down the aisle, I caught glimpses of the guests. Designer suits, jewelry that sparkled under the cathedral lights, faces I didn't recognize. Emma had made it clear that most of my friends and relatives weren't quite the right fit for this crowd. I'd accepted it, like I'd accepted so many other small wounds over the years. The organ music swelled around us, but all I could think about was the last conversation Emma and I had about today. She'd asked me, in that careful voice she'd developed since dating Marcus, if I could maybe borrow a better suit. "Something that photographs well, Dad. The Ashford's photographer is quite expensive." The words had stung more than she probably intended, but I'd nodded and smiled like always. I'd raised Emma and her older sister Sarah alone after their mother died when they were 8 and 12. 23 years of single parenthood, 23 years of putting them first in every decision I made. Now, walking toward the altar where Marcus waited with his perfect smile and his perfectly rich family, I wondered if any of those sacrifices had mattered. Halfway down the aisle, I heard Marcus adjusting the microphone. He'd insisted on saying something during the ceremony, some modern touch the Ashfords thought was charming. I assumed it would be sweet words about Emma, maybe a thank you to the families. Instead, his voice boomed through the church speakers with a tone I'd never heard from him before. "Well, here comes the old poor guy. Only invited out of charity, folks." The words hit me like a physical blow. My steps faltered, and Emma's grip on my arm tightened, but not to comfort me. I could feel her mortification, her wish that she could disappear. The church erupted in laughter from the Ashford side. Rich, delighted laughter that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Mrs. Ashford was actually clapping her hands together in amusement. Her husband had that smug smile wealthy men get when they think they're being cleverly cruel. The bridesmaids, all Emma's new friends from her corporate job, were giggling behind their bouquets. I kept walking because what else could I do? Each step felt like walking through quicksand. The laughter continued, and I heard scattered comments from the pews. "Oh, Marcus, you're terrible. Poor man, looks like he borrowed that suit. Emma's come so far from her humble beginnings." My face burned with humiliation, but something deeper was breaking inside me. This wasn't just about a cruel joke. This was about years of feeling like an outsider in my own daughter's life. Years of watching her grow ashamed of the man who'd given up everything to raise her. When we finally reached the altar, I was supposed to lift Emma's veil and kiss her cheek before giving her away. Instead, she barely looked at me as Marcus continued his performance. "Thank you for walking her down, Patrick. I know it must have been hard to find the time off from your busy schedule." More laughter rippled through the congregation. I stood there for a moment that felt like eternity. Emma's face was flushed, but not with anger at her husband-to-be. She was embarrassed by me, by her father, the man who had worked 3 jobs to put her through college, who'd sold everything valuable I owned to make sure she and Sarah never went without. As I turned to take my seat in the back row, not the front where the father of the bride should sit, but the back where Emma had quietly suggested I'd be more comfortable, I caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. The best man was staring at me with an odd expression, not laughter like the others, but something that looked almost like recognition. He was squinting at me, his head tilted as if trying to place where he'd seen me before. I took my seat and tried to focus on the ceremony, but the best man kept glancing over at me. There was something in his expression that made my stomach twist with a different kind of nervousness. Not the shame I'd been drowning in, but something else entirely. The ceremony continued around me, but I was lost in my own thoughts. How had it come to this? How had the little girl who used to fall asleep in my arms while I read her bedtime stories turned into a woman who saw me as nothing more than an embarrassment to be tolerated? I thought about all the times Emma had asked me not to pick her up from school events because other parents might see my old work truck. The way she'd stopped inviting me to her college graduation parties because I didn't fit in with her new crowd. How she'd introduced me to Marcus's family as just my dad, with no mention of what I'd done to raise her. As the vows were exchanged, I made a decision. This would be the last time I let anyone, even my own daughter, treat me like I was something to be ashamed of. Sitting in that back pew, watching my daughter promise her life to a man who just humiliated me in front of 200 people, my mind drifted back to a rainy Tuesday morning 23 years ago. The morning everything changed. I was 34 then, running a successful small manufacturing company I'd built from nothing. We made custom metal fixtures for restaurants and hotels. Nothing glamorous, but it was mine. I had 12 employees, a nice house in the suburbs, and a future that looked bright. Then Linda collapsed in our kitchen while making breakfast for the girls. The stroke took her in 3 days. Sarah was 12, Emma was 8, and suddenly I was a widower with 2 daughters who didn't understand why Mommy wouldn't wake up. I remember sitting in our lawyer's office a week after the funeral, listening to him explain that Linda's medical bills had eaten through most of our savings. The life insurance would help, but not for long. "You'll need to make some decisions, Patrick," he'd said gently. "The business is doing well, but raising 2 girls alone while trying to run a company, it's going to be challenging." I thought I could do both. For 6 months, I tried. I'd drop the girls at school, rush to the factory, try to manage production schedules and client meetings while worrying about who would pick them up if I ran late. Sarah started acting out, getting in fights at school. Emma became so quiet, I worried she'd forgotten how to speak. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon in December. Emma was supposed to be in the school Christmas pageant, playing an angel. She'd been practicing her lines for weeks, so proud of her little part. I was stuck in a meeting with a major client who was threatening to cancel a huge order because we were behind schedule. By the time I got to the school, the auditorium was empty except for Emma, still in her angel costume, sitting alone on the stage. "Everyone else got picked up, Daddy," she said when she saw me. She wasn't crying, which somehow made it worse. Mrs. Peterson waited with me. That night, after I tucked both girls into bed, I sat at my kitchen table and made a decision that would define the next 2 decades of my life. I called my business partner the next morning and told him I wanted to sell my shares. "Patrick, you're not thinking clearly," Mike had argued. "This company is your future. The girls will understand when they're older." But I knew better. They needed their father more than I needed my company. So I sold everything. The business, the big house, even Linda's jewelry except for her wedding ring, which I kept for the girls. We moved to a smaller apartment across town, closer to their school. I took a job as a supervisor at a packaging plant. The pay was decent, but nothing compared to what I'd been making. Still, it had regular hours. I could drop the girls off at school and be there when they got home. I could attend every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every soccer game. For the first few years, it worked. Sarah and Emma adjusted to our new life. They made friends, did well in school, seemed happy. I thought we'd found our rhythm. But as they got older, especially when Sarah started high school, I began to notice the changes. She'd ask if I could park around the corner when dropping her off so her friends wouldn't see my old Honda. She'd make excuses about why I couldn't attend school events if other parents would be there. "It's not that I'm ashamed of you, Dad," she'd explained one evening when I confronted her about it. "It's just the other kids' parents are lawyers and doctors and business owners. You work in a factory." The words cut deep, but I understood. Teenagers are cruel about differences. I told myself it was just a phase. When it came time for college, Sarah had her heart set on Northwestern, expensive, prestigious. perfect for the image she wanted to build for herself. I'd been saving every penny I could, but it wasn't enough. So I took out loans, worked overtime, even picked up a weekend job cleaning offices. "Are you sure about this, Dad?" Emma had asked one night, finding me at the kitchen table surrounded by financial aid forms and loan applications. She was 16 then, old enough to understand what the numbers meant. "Your sister deserves her chance," I told her. "We'll figure out a way." I figured it out by selling Linda's car, which I'd kept in the garage like a shrine, by taking a second mortgage on our little house, by working 70-hour weeks until my back ached and my hands were permanently stained with machine oil. Sarah went to Northwestern. She thrived there, made connections with wealthy classmates, started dating boys whose fathers owned companies like the one I used to run. And slowly, I began to disappear from her life. She'd come home for holidays with stories about her new friends' families, their vacation homes in the Hamptons, their charity galas, their exclusive country clubs. She'd look around our modest living room with barely concealed disappointment. "Dad, you should really think about going back to school," she'd suggest. "Get some kind of business degree, maybe start another company." But I was 50 by then, exhausted from decades of choosing my daughter's dreams over my own. And besides, Emma still needed me. She was the sweet one, the one who still hugged me goodnight and asked me to help with her homework. I told myself that at least one of my girls still loved me for who I was. I was wrong about that too. Emma followed her sister to college, though not as expensive a school. I thought she'd learned from watching Sarah's transformation, but the same thing happened. The corporate internships, the networking events, the slow drift away from the man who'd raised her. By the time she met Marcus, I'd already become an embarrassment in her mind. Someone to be managed carefully, kept at arm's length from her new, improved life. The years of working multiple jobs had taken their toll on my body. My back hurt constantly from lifting packages, my hands were scarred from machinery, and I looked older than my 57 years. But I'd never regretted the sacrifices. Every dollar spent on their education, every missed opportunity to rebuild my own career, every lonely evening spent working overtime while they were out building their new lives. It had all been worth it because they were my daughters, or so I told myself. Sitting in that church pew, listening to the priest drone on about love and commitment, I realized something that should have been obvious years earlier. I'd raised 2 daughters who saw my sacrifices not as love, but as weakness, who saw my simple life not as contentment, but as failure. The irony was devastating. While I'd been working those extra shifts and cleaning offices on weekends, I'd also been tinkering in my garage with packaging designs, old habits from my business days, ways to make the machinery at Morrison more efficient. Over the years, those sketches had evolved into genuine innovations. 6 months ago, when Blackstone Industries approached me about purchasing my patents, I'd almost said no. The money seemed impossible, the amount too large to be real, $47 million for ideas I'd developed in my spare time, solutions to problems I'd encountered during 20 years of blue-collar work. But I'd said yes, not because I wanted wealth, but because I wanted security for my family. I'd imagined Emma's face when I told her she'd never have to worry about money again. I'd pictured helping with down payments on houses, funding graduate school if she wanted it, maybe even grandchildren's college funds. I'd kept the money secret because I wanted to surprise them at the right moment. But as the months passed and I watched Emma plan her wedding, watched her treat me like a burden she was obligated to include, I'd begun to realize something darker. The right moment would never come. Because the daughters I'd raised, the women I'd sacrificed everything for, had already decided who I was in their minds, and no amount of money would change their fundamental lack of respect for the man who'd given up everything to love them. The wedding ceremony was ending now. The priest was blessing the union, and Emma was kissing her new husband, the same husband who'd just publicly mocked her father for the entertainment of his wealthy friends. As the recessional music began and the wedding party filed out, I made a decision. If my daughters wanted to judge me by my bank account rather than my character, then perhaps it was time they learned the truth about both. The wedding planning had started 8 months ago, and from the very first meeting with the Ashfords, I knew I was going to be a problem they'd need to solve. So Patrick, Mrs. Ashford had said that day in their pristine living room, her voice dripping with the kind of politeness that feels like an insult. "What do you do for work?" I'd answered honestly. "I'm a supervisor at Morrison Packaging." The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Ashford cleared his throat and quickly changed the subject to venue options. Emma stared at her hands. Marcus jumped in with some story about his golf game. But I'd seen the look that passed between his parents, the same look people get when they step in something unpleasant. After that meeting, Emma called me that evening. "Dad, maybe you could tell people you're in manufacturing management," she suggested carefully. "It sounds more professional." "That would be lying, sweetheart." "It's not lying, it's just presenting things in the best light." But it was lying, and we both knew it. Just like it was lying when she told the Ashfords I'd been too busy with work to attend their country club dinner the following month. The truth was, she hadn't invited me. The exclusion started small, wedding planning meetings scheduled during my work hours. Venue visits on days when I couldn't get away. "Don't worry about it, Dad," Emma would say. "Marcus's family has experience with these big events. They know what they're doing." I tried to be understanding. The Ashfords were paying for most of the wedding after all. It made sense they'd want input on the details, but as the months went on, I realized I wasn't just being excluded from planning decisions. I was being erased from the wedding entirely. The guest list was my first real wake-up call. Emma brought it over one evening, a thick document printed on expensive paper. "I need you to look this over," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Make sure I didn't miss anyone important from your side." I scanned the names. My brother Tom was there, along with his wife, my sister Julie, a few cousins. But that was it. None of my friends from work, none of the neighbors who'd watched Emma grow up, none of the people who'd been part of our life for decades. "What about Jim and Carol from next door?" I asked. "They've known you since you were 10. Emma shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, we have limited space. The Ashfords have a lot of business associates they need to invite. What about my co-workers? Mike Peterson helped me coach your soccer team for 3 years. It's going to be a very formal event, black tie. I'm not sure those people would be comfortable." Those people, my friends, my community, dismissed as those people who wouldn't fit into her new world. Then came the conversation about my role in the ceremony. I'd assumed, naturally, that I'd be walking Emma down the aisle and giving a speech at the reception. Sarah had made sure I'd been excluded from her wedding altogether, claiming it was going to be a small ceremony, though the photos on Facebook later showed 50 guests. "About the father-daughter dance," Emma said one afternoon while we were addressing invitations. "Marcus and I were thinking we might skip the traditional parent dances, keep things more modern." "What about my speech?" She looked up from the invitation she was working on, her pen hovering over the elegant script. "The schedule is pretty tight, Dad. Marcus's father is the best man speech. Plus, Marcus wanted to say something himself. We don't want the reception to drag on." I sat there watching my daughter carefully craft lies to spare my feelings, and I realized she'd learned to see me the same way the Ashfords did, as someone to be managed, minimized, kept from embarrassing the real family. The worst part came 2 weeks before the wedding. Emma showed up at my apartment with a garment bag. "What's this?" I asked. "Marcus's father thought you might want to borrow one of his tuxedos," she said, not meeting my eyes. "For the wedding. It's a very formal event, and he has several that he never wears." I stared at the bag. "You want me to wear your future father-in-law's hand-me-downs to my own daughter's wedding?" "It's not like that, Dad. It's just the photographer is expensive, and the pictures will last forever. We want everything to look perfect." Perfect. Meaning I wasn't perfect enough as I was. "I can rent my own tuxedo, Emma," she bit her lip. "I know you can. It's just, money's been tight for you lately, and we thought—" "You thought wrong." The tuxedo stayed in my closet, untouched. The next day I went to the nicest formal wear shop in town and rented a tuxedo that cost me 2 weeks' grocery money, because I still had some pride left, even if my daughter didn't think I deserved any. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Ashfords Country Club. I arrived exactly on time, wearing my best suit. hoping to blend into the background. The moment I walked into the private dining room, I felt the familiar chill of being somewhere I didn't belong. Mrs. Ashford greeted me with air kisses and the kind of bright smile that never reaches the eyes. "Patrick, how wonderful that you could make it," as if my attendance at my own daughter's rehearsal dinner was optional. The seating arrangement told the whole story. The Ashfords sat at the head table with Marcus and Emma. The wedding party filled the tables closest to them. I was placed at a table near the back with my brother Tom and his wife, plus 2 elderly relatives from Marcus's side who clearly had no idea who I was. During dinner, Mr. Ashford stood to give a toast. He talked about how proud he was to welcome Emma into their family, how grateful they were to have found someone so special for their son. He thanked the wedding party, the bridesmaids, even the country club staff. He never mentioned me. Not once in his 5-minute speech did Emma's father-in-law acknowledge that she actually had a father who'd raised her, loved her, sacrificed for her. I was sitting right there, but I might as well have been invisible. After the dinner, as people mingled and chatted, I found myself standing alone near the bar. That's when I overheard Mrs. Ashford talking to one of her friends. "Oh, the father situation is a bit awkward," she was saying in a stage whisper. "Emma's from very humble beginnings, you know. Sweet girl, but the family background is, well, let's just say we're helping her transition into a more appropriate social circle." Her friend nodded sympathetically. "How generous of you to be so inclusive." "We believe in giving people opportunities to better themselves," Mrs. Ashford replied, "though, of course, some people adapt more easily than others." I walked away before I could hear more. Outside in the country club parking lot, I stood next to my 15-year-old Honda and tried to process what I'd just heard. Emma's future mother-in-law was discussing me like I was a charity case, a problem to be solved through their generosity, and Emma was letting it happen. That night, I called her when I got home. "We need to talk," I said. "About what, Dad?" "About whether you actually want me at this wedding." There was a long pause. "Of course I want you there. You're my father." "Then why do I feel like I'm being invited out of obligation?" Another pause. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, she said, "Maybe because you are." The words hung between us like a blade. Finally, the truth we'd been dancing around for months. "I see," I said. "Dad, I don't mean it like that. It's just, this is important to me. This wedding, this family, this life I'm building with Marcus. I need everything to be perfect." I'm not perfect enough." She didn't deny it. The conversation ended awkwardly, with promises to talk more later that we both knew wouldn't happen. I hung up the phone and sat in my quiet apartment, finally understanding that tomorrow's wedding wasn't about celebrating my daughter. It was about burying the man who'd raised her. The ceremony dragged on after Marcus's cruel joke, but I barely heard the vows. I sat in that back pew, my face still burning from the laughter that had rippled through the church, trying to decide if I should just leave. The only thing keeping me in my seat was the thought of Emma's reaction if her father walked out during her wedding ceremony. Even now, after everything, I couldn't bear to hurt her that way. But I kept catching the best man staring at me, David Richardson, according to the program. He was about Marcus's age, maybe 32, with the kind of confident bearing that comes from growing up wealthy. Throughout the ceremony, his eyes kept drifting to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. When the priest finally pronounced Marcus and Emma husband and wife, I watched my youngest daughter kiss a man who just publicly humiliated her father for laughs. She looked radiant, completely caught up in her fairy tale moment. I wondered if she'd even registered what Marcus had said about me, or if she'd trained herself not to hear such things. The recessional music began, and the wedding party filed out. I stood with the other guests, preparing to make my way to the reception, when David Richardson broke away from the group and walked directly toward me. "Excuse me," he said, his voice uncertain. "This might sound strange, but are you Patrick Hartwell?" I blinked in surprise. "Yes." His face broke into a smile that looked nothing like the smug expressions I'd been seeing all day. "I knew it. I saw you on the news about 6 months ago. Channel 7's Business Spotlight segment?" My stomach dropped. Of all the people to remember that interview, why did it have to be Marcus's best man? You probably have me confused with someone else, I said. But David was already shaking his head. No, I remember distinctly. Patrick Hartwell, the guy who sold his manufacturing patents to Blackstone Industries for, what was it, 47 million? The number hung in the air between us like a bomb about to explode. Around us, wedding guests were filing out of the church, chattering about cocktail hour and the reception. But David wasn't moving. He was staring at me with the kind of intense focus that made my palms sweat. That must have been someone else, I repeated, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. David pulled out his phone and started typing. After a few seconds, he turned the screen toward me. There was my face, looking uncomfortable, in a suit I'd borrowed for the occasion, standing next to a reporter outside Blackstone's corporate offices. "Local inventor strikes it rich," read the headline. "Packaging plant supervisor sells patents for millions." I closed my eyes. I'd hoped that story would fade away quietly. The reporter had made such a big deal out of it, painting me as some kind of rags-to-riches success story. But the truth was more complicated. "Look," I said quietly, "could we not discuss this here?" But David wasn't listening. His eyes were wide with something between amazement and horror. "Wait a minute. Marcus just called you the poor guy invited out of charity, but you're worth... It's complicated." "What a... Complicated?" His voice was getting louder, drawing attention from nearby guests. "You're probably worth more than Marcus's entire family, and he just... Mr. Richardson, please." But he was looking back toward the church doors, where Marcus was posing for pictures with Emma. The photographer was directing them through various poses, while Mrs. Ashford fussed with Emma's train. "Does Emma know?" David asked. That was the question I'd been dreading for months. "It's not that simple." "Not that simple? Your daughter just let her husband humiliate you in front of 200 people when you could probably buy and sell everyone in that church." Other guests were starting to stare now. I could see Mrs. Ashford's sharp eyes fixed on us from across the church steps. She had the look of someone who sensed drama brewing and was calculating how to manage it. "Please," I said again, but David was already walking away. Not toward the parking lot where the guests were supposed to go for the reception, but straight toward Marcus and Emma. I followed, my heart pounding. This wasn't how I'd wanted the truth to come out. Hell, I wasn't sure I'd wanted it to come out at all. "Marcus," David called out, interrupting a photo of the bride and groom with his parents. "We need to talk." Marcus turned, still glowing with post-ceremony adrenaline. "What's up, man? Aren't we supposed to head to the reception?" David glanced at me, then back at his friend. The photographer was still clicking away, capturing what he probably thought was a candid moment of wedding joy. He had no idea he was about to document the beginning of a disaster. "That man you just called the poor guy," David said, pointing at me, "that's Patrick Hartwell." Marcus shrugged, his smile faltering slightly. "Yeah, Emma's dad." "What about him?" "Patrick Hartwell sold his manufacturing patents to Blackstone Industries 6 months ago for $47 million. The words hit like a thunderclap. The photographer's camera stopped clicking. Emma's bouquet slipped from her hands. Mrs. Ashford's mouth actually fell open. Marcus stared at David, then at me, then back at David. "What are you talking about?" David held up his phone again, showing the news article. "I saw him on TV. This is the guy who invented some kind of revolutionary packaging process that every major corporation wants. He's been working at Morrison Packaging for 20 years, but he owns patents that made him one of the richest men in the state." Emma was staring at me now, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Dad?" I stood there surrounded by wedding guests who were starting to gather around us, drawn by the tension in the air. The photographer had recovered and was snapping pictures again, probably realizing he was capturing something much more dramatic than standard wedding photos. "Is it true?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at my daughter, this beautiful young woman who'd spent the last few years treating me like an embarrassment, who'd hidden me from her new social circle, excluded me from her wedding planning, and just watched her husband mock me in front of everyone we knew. "Yes," I said simply. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Mrs. Ashford pushed through the crowd toward us. Emma staggered slightly, reaching for Marcus's arm for support. Mr. Ashford's face went through several color changes. And Marcus looked like someone had just told him the earth was flat. "Oh, 47 million, Emma whispered. "The patent's sold for that amount." "Yes, but you live in that little apartment. You drive that old car. You work at the packaging plant. I still work there because I like my job. I live simply because I choose to. The money doesn't change who I am." Mrs. Ashford had reached us now, her sharp eyes darting between me and the crowd of guests who were hanging on every word. I could practically see her calculating the social implications of having just spent months treating a multimillionaire like hired help. "Well," she said in a voice that was probably supposed to sound gracious, but came out strangled, "isn't this a wonderful surprise? Emma dear, you never mentioned—" "Because I asked her not to," I said, looking directly at Emma. "I wanted to see how people would treat me when they thought I was just a working man, when they thought I had nothing to offer except my love for my daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Around us, wedding guests whispered and stared. The photographer kept clicking away, capturing what was probably the most expensive wedding disaster in the state's history. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were from shame or shock or something else entirely. Marcus just stood there, his face cycling through emotions like a slot machine. And I realized, standing there in my rented tuxedo surrounded by people who'd spent months treating me like charity case, that I finally had everyone's attention. The question was, what was I going to do with it? The reception hall at the Ashford Country Club had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in ivory silk, each centerpiece worth more than I used to make in a week. But the magical atmosphere couldn't hide the tension crackling through the air as our small group from the church steps made our way inside. Word had already spread. I could feel the stares, hear the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I passed. The guests who'd been laughing at Marcus's joke an hour earlier were now looking at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to embarrassment to barely concealed calculation. Emma hadn't said a word since learning the truth. She walked beside Marcus, her hand on his arm, but I could see the storm brewing behind her eyes. Marcus himself kept glancing at me like I was a puzzle he couldn't solve. Mrs. Ashford, ever the social coordinator, was trying to salvage the situation. "Everyone, let's take our seats," she announced in her practiced hostess voice. "We have a wonderful evening planned." But I could see her mind working, recalculating everything she thought she knew about this wedding, this family, this social dynamic she'd so carefully orchestrated. The seating arrangements, which had seemed like such deliberate insults just hours earlier, now looked different. My table at the back of the room, far from the head table where the bride and groom sat with their important guests, suddenly felt less like exile and more like a choice I'd made. As the cocktail hour began, people started approaching me, hesitantly at first, then with increasing boldness, as word continued to spread about who I really was. "Mr. Hartwell," said a man I didn't recognize, extending his hand. "I'm Robert Chen. I handle corporate acquisitions for Henderson Group." "I had no idea Emma was your daughter. What an incredible story. Your patent's revolutionizing the packaging industry." I shook his hand politely, but didn't elaborate. This was exactly what I'd been trying to avoid for months. People treating me differently because of money instead of character. More introductions followed. Business cards were pressed into my hand. Invitations to golf outings, charity galas, private dinners, all from people who'd either ignored me completely or treated me with barely concealed disdain just hours earlier. Through it all, Emma watched from across the room. I could see her talking intensely with Marcus, their heads bent together in urgent conversation. Once or twice, Marcus looked over at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shame, maybe, or calculation. About an hour into the reception, Emma finally approached me. She'd been crying. Her makeup was carefully repaired, but I could see the telltale signs around her eyes that only a father would notice. "Dad," she said quietly, "can we talk? Privately?" I followed her out to a balcony overlooking the country club's golf course. The setting sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured greens. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked finally. I looked at my daughter, this beautiful woman who had grown so far from the little girl who used to help me change the oil in our car. Would it have changed anything? She started to answer quickly, then stopped. We both knew the truth. If she'd known about the money, she would have treated me differently, but not necessarily better, just different. "The patents," she said. "When did you sell them?" 6 months ago. I'd been working on the designs for years, refining them in my spare time. When Blackstone approached me, I almost said, "No." I liked my quiet life. "But you said yes?" I nodded. "I thought about you girls, about grandchildren I might have someday. I wanted to make sure there was something left behind, something that would give you security even after I'm gone." Emma's eyes filled with tears again. "Dad, I'm so sorry. About the wedding planning, about keeping you out of things, about being ashamed of me." She flinched. "I was never ashamed of you." But we both knew that wasn't entirely true. She'd been ashamed of what she thought I represented, the blue-collar life she'd worked so hard to escape. "Emma, I need you to understand something," I said carefully. "I could have told you about the money months ago. I could have bought a mansion, driven a luxury car, played the part of the successful businessman. But I chose not to. Why? Because I wanted to see who you really were. Not who you'd pretend to be if you thought I was rich, but who you actually became when you thought I was just your poor old dad." The words hung between us like a challenge. Emma wrapped her arms around herself, staring out at the golf course. "And what did you find out?" she asked quietly. I took a deep breath. This was the conversation I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. I found out that somewhere along the way, I lost my daughter. The little girl who used to be proud of her dad no matter what he did for a living grew up to be a woman who saw him as an embarrassment to be managed. Emma turned to face me, tears streaming down her cheeks. "That's not fair, isn't it? When was the last time you invited me to anything without apologizing for who I am first? When did you last introduce me to your friends without that look of resignation, like you were disappointed they'd have to meet the real me?" She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it, because there wasn't an argument to make. "I love you, Emma," I continued. "I love you enough to have given up everything I built to raise you and your sister. But love shouldn't mean accepting disrespect. And that's what I've been doing for years." From inside the reception hall, we could hear the band starting up, the beginning of the formal dinner service. Emma's wedding was continuing without us, but for the first time in months, we were having an honest conversation. "Marcus," she said suddenly, "what about him? When he made that joke, I should have said something. I should have stopped him, but you didn't." She shook her head, looking younger and more vulnerable than I'd seen her in years. "I was embarrassed, not of you, but I don't know, of the whole situation, of how it looked." "And how did it look, Emma?" Another long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, like I was marrying into a family that was better than mine. There it was. The truth she'd been trying to hide from herself for months. She'd convinced herself that the Ashfords were upgrading her, that Marcus was her ticket to a better class of people. And I'd been the reminder of where she came from. Something to be hidden away or apologized for. "But that's not what really happened, is it?" I asked gently. She looked confused. "What do you mean?" "You married into a family that judges people by their bank accounts instead of their character. A family that thinks it's appropriate to mock a guest at their own wedding. A family that treats kindness as weakness and money as the only measure of worth." Emma stared at me, and I could see the pieces falling into place in her mind. The months of subtle put-downs from Mrs. Ashford, the way Marcus's father had dismissed her stories about our family, the constant implication that she should be grateful for their acceptance. "They're not better people than us, Emma. They're just richer, or at least they were until today." For the first time since the truth came out, Emma almost smiled. "You really are worth more than all of them combined, aren't you?" "On paper, yes, but that's not what matters." She nodded slowly, beginning to understand. Then her face fell again. "What happens now, Dad? I mean, with us, with everything." I looked through the glass doors at the reception continuing inside. Marcus was at the head table, probably fielding questions about his new father-in-law. Mrs. Ashford was working the room, no doubt trying to spin this revelation in whatever way served her best. That depends, I said. Are you ready to decide who you really want to be? Not who you think you should be to fit into someone else's world, but who you actually are. Emma was quiet for a long time, watching the last light fade over the golf course. When she finally spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been all day. I think I've been pretending for so long, I'm not sure I remember. Then maybe it's time to find out. 3 weeks after the wedding, I was sitting in my lawyer's office, signing the final papers that would change everything. Margaret Walsh had been handling my legal affairs since the patent sale, and she'd listened patiently as I explained what I wanted to do. Are you absolutely certain about this, Patrick? She asked, sliding the documents across her mahogany desk. Once these changes to your will are official, there's no going back without significant legal complications. I picked up the pen and looked at the papers one more time. Emma's name had been removed from the primary beneficiary list. In its place were 3 recipients. Sarah's children, my grandchildren I barely knew, would receive education funds that couldn't be touched by their mother. The local technical college would receive an endowment for scholarships aimed at working-class students. And the largest portion would go to a foundation I was establishing for single parents trying to further their education. I'm certain, I said and signed my name. The decision hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. The conversation with Emma on the balcony had been honest, perhaps the first truly honest conversation we'd had in years. But honesty, I'd learned, doesn't always lead to change. In the weeks following the wedding, Emma had tried to rebuild our relationship. She'd called regularly, suggested dinner, even offered to have Marcus apologize for his behavior at the ceremony. But every conversation felt forced, colored by the new knowledge of my wealth. She was trying, but I could tell she was still calculating, still wondering what my money meant for her future. The breaking point had come 2 weeks ago. Emma had called, ostensibly, to check on me, but the conversation had quickly turned to Marcus's business struggles. His marketing firm was hemorrhaging clients, she explained. They were worried about making mortgage payments on the expensive house they'd bought in the exclusive neighborhood where the Ashfords expected them to live. I'm not asking for anything, Dad, she'd said carefully. I just thought you should know what's going on with us. But of course, she was asking. The subtext was as clear as if she'd written it in neon letters. Now that she knew I had money, she expected me to solve their problems the way I'd solved every problem in her childhood. I'm sorry to hear you're struggling, I'd replied. Have you and Marcus considered downsizing? Maybe finding a place you can actually afford? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. They didn't want practical advice. They wanted a bailout. We can't just move, Dad. Marcus has a reputation to maintain. His clients expect a certain level of success. There it was again. That same obsession with image over substance that had poisoned our relationship for years. Even after everything, Emma still believed that appearances mattered more than reality. That's when I knew that the money hadn't changed her. It had just revealed who she'd already become. Now, walking out of Margaret's office with the new will safely filed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: freedom. For the first time since Linda died, my future was entirely my own. No more sacrificing my happiness for daughters who saw me as a problem to be managed. No more accepting disrespect in the name of family loyalty. My phone buzzed as I reached my car. A text from Emma. Dad, can we have lunch this weekend? Marcus wants to talk to you about something important. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. That afternoon, I drove to Morrison Packaging for what would be my last day of work. I'd given my notice the week before, much to everyone's surprise. My supervisor, Jerry, had been genuinely confused. But Patrick, you've been here 20 years. This is your life. No, I'd corrected him gently. This was my job. My life is just beginning. I'd decided to retire early and travel. Not the kind of luxury travel Emma probably expected me to choose, but real travel. I wanted to see the places Linda and I had dreamed of visiting before she got sick. I wanted to volunteer with organizations that helped people like I used to be, working parents struggling to build better lives for their children. Most importantly, I wanted to figure out who Patrick Hartwell was when he wasn't defined by being someone's father. As I cleaned out my locker that afternoon, I found a photo Emma had given me years ago. It showed her at her college graduation, smiling and proud in her cap and gown. I'd been so happy that day, watching my youngest daughter accomplish something Linda and I had only dreamed of. Looking at the photo now, I tried to remember when things had started to change between us. When had my pride in her achievements turned into her embarrassment about my limitations? When had our relationship become a transaction instead of love? Maybe it had been gradual, so slow I hadn't noticed until it was too late. Or maybe it had been inevitable once Emma decided that success meant escaping everything that reminded her of where she came from, including me. I tucked the photo into my jacket pocket, not because I wanted to carry the pain with me, but because I wanted to remember the lesson it taught. Love without respect isn't really love at all. The next morning, I started packing. My little apartment didn't hold much worth keeping. Just a few pieces of Linda's jewelry for Emma's future children, some photographs, and the books I'd been meaning to read for 20 years. Everything else could be donated or sold. I was starting over, and I didn't need the weight of the past holding me back. As I packed, I thought about the conversation I'd had with my brother Tom the night before. He'd called after hearing about the wedding incident through the family grapevine. "So what are you going to do now?" he'd asked. "I'm going to live my life for me," I'd said. "For the first time in 23 years, I'm going to do exactly what I want to do." "And what about the girls?" I'd paused, considering my answer. "They're adults now, Tom. They made their choices, and I made mine. If they want a relationship with me, they know where to find me. But it'll have to be on different terms than before." "That's pretty harsh, Patrick." "Is it? Or is it finally healthy?" Tom hadn't had an answer for that. My phone rang as I was sealing the last box. Emma's name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message a few minutes later. "Dad, I know you're probably mad about the money thing, but we need to talk. Marcus thinks you're being unreasonable. And honestly, so do I. We're family. Family helps each other. Please call me back." I deleted the voicemail and turned off my phone. The next day, I loaded my Honda with the few belongings I wanted to keep and drove away from the city where I'd spent the last 23 years sacrificing everything for daughters who'd never learned to value sacrifice. I drove west, toward the mountains Linda and I had always planned to visit. I had no specific destination in mind, no timeline to keep, no one to answer to except myself. For the first time in decades, I was free. 6 months later, I was living in a small cabin outside of Asheville, North Carolina. I'd bought it with cash, furnished it simply, and settled into a routine that revolved around my own interests instead of other people's needs. I volunteered at a literacy center 3 days a week, hiked the mountain trails on weekends, and spent evenings reading books and listening to music I'd never had time for before. I'd changed my phone number and didn't share it with anyone except Tom and Margaret Walsh. Occasionally, Tom would update me on family news. Sarah was getting divorced. Emma and Marcus had sold their expensive house and moved into something smaller, but I didn't ask for details, and he didn't offer them. I wasn't hiding exactly, but I wasn't making myself available to be found either. If my daughters wanted to rebuild a relationship with me, they would have to work for it. They would have to prove that they valued me for more than what I could provide. So far, they hadn't tried. One evening in late spring, I was sitting on my cabin's front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple when my phone rang. Margaret's name appeared on the screen. "Patrick, I thought you should know. Emma hired a private investigator to find you." I wasn't surprised. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing, of course. Attorney-client privilege, but she's persistent. She's been calling my office every few days." "Any idea what she wants?" "She says she needs to talk to you about something important, something about making things right." I rocked gently in my chair, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "She had 23 years to make things right, Margaret. I'm not sure why she thinks she deserves another chance now. Maybe she's finally learned something. Maybe. But I'm not ready to find out." After hanging up, I sat on that porch until well past midnight, thinking about forgiveness and second chances and the difference between being alone and being lonely. I was alone in these mountains, but I wasn't lonely. For the first time in my adult life, I was exactly where I wanted to be, doing exactly what I chose to do, with no one to disappoint or be disappointed by. And if that made me selfish, after 23 years of selflessness, I could live with that. The mountains didn't judge me for having money or for lacking it. The sunrise didn't care about my daughter's choices or my own. The life I was building here was honest, simple, and entirely mine. It was enough, more than enough. It was peace.